And Ralph Keeney is going to talk to us now about making smarter decisions. So in our triumvirate of speakers, he's going to talk to us about kind of how we can do this better, right? And because everything we do in the business world is around making good decisions. I love the way he puts it. I sorry to steal your thunder, Ralph, but you know, this is the skill that we should be very good at. And so in the first case, if we're highly stressed, then we're not doing the best we can with the skill we might even have, but we've got to get better at the skill. Ralph is a consultant, speaker, and author and advisor to individuals, organizations, and governments, and helps them make smarter decisions. He has previously been a professor at MIT, at USC, the University of Southern California, and Duke. He also created and managed the decision and risk analysis group at a major consulting firm. He's a member of the National Academy of Engineering, has written several books, and the most recent title is Give Yourself a Nudge, which I highly encourage folks to take a look at. We're really excited to have you here, Ralph, and we're really excited to learn from you. So I'm gonna go on mute, and I'll be monitoring the chat room. Ralph has programmed into his presentation 4 places that he's going to pause to take questions. So again, feel free to type your questions as you think of them, and at each pause session, if they're in there, we'll ask Ralph those questions. Thanks again for being here, Ralph, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. It's certainly a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to talking to some of the participants after it also. Decisions should be the primary management skill because they are the only purposeful way you can influence anything in business or in your life. The rest just happens as a consequence of others' decisions and happenstance. Now you might think, oh, you know, if I decide to get much more physically fit, that's going to really have an influence on my life. That's right, but that won't happen unless you make a decision and you follow through on those decisions. So decisions empower you to make the contributions you want and to really have the quality of life you'd like. I'm going to talk about practical ways to make better decisions, not ways that you need a giant analysis and special training. What do I mean by practical ways? Well, as an example, consider somebody very important you are going to meet at a dinner. You had this opportunity and you're supposed to set it up. You think, well, I'd like it to be a great meal. I'd like it to have local cuisine and near their hotel when they're visiting the town. You choose a place that you think's great. You go there. The meal is great, but the evening is a disaster. What happened? It was way too loud and you couldn't have a decent discussion. So you didn't really meet the person like you wanted or discuss the things that you wish to discuss. Had you thought about what do I hope to achieve in this meeting, you likely would have come up with, well, I want to have a quality discussion, or I would like a quiet restaurant, and then you never would have chosen that alternative. In fact, you wouldn't have even probably picked it as an alternative that's potential. That's what I call a nudge, identifying that objective. And it can certainly push you in the direction of a good decision without any analysis or anything. And it's all in structuring of the decision that you want to address where these important things happen. And little background, I think many of you know this, but over the past 50 years, we've learned a lot about how people do make decisions. They've identified way over 175 names, separate biases and errors or shortcomings. There's a lot of different words for these. I sometimes use decision traps. And some key ones are, we select the default alternative often, the one that doesn't require us to do much. You just keep on going. Or the easiest to implement. We anchor on first thoughts, like we get a feeling this is a good alternative, and then we stay anchored on that a little bit regardless of what information comes in. And then we get into the sunk cost problem, and you know all these difficulties. And so how can we avoid some of those things? Well, an interesting book, a fascinating book, was written in 2008 by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein called Nudge. And the way the decision is presented to the decision maker influences which choice they will make. The person who presents, they referred to as a choice architect, and they identified a large number of cases where they can improve your decision making. An important one that I knew about before this and is in their book, when I went to USC, you could sign up for the retirement plan. On the first day of work, you sign up all kinds of things, you know, so that you're in the systems. And then you come to, well, would you like to be in the retirement plan? And to be in it, you have to fill out a lot of forms and sign up. To not be in it, you don't have to do anything. So that's the default. That's easy. And what happened, the retirement plan, if you put in $5,000 of your own money, part of your salary taken out, the school usually puts in an additional 5 or even sometimes up to 10, depending on the university and the time. So you get quite a lot of, quote, free money quickly. And it's in an account with just your name on it. So if you're there 3 years, you get 3 years of the retirement account. When you leave, it goes with you. If you're there 40 years, you get that. No brainer. And then I found out that 50% of the people did not sign up for that retirement plan. The schools found out about it too, and they were a little worried. You're going to have a lot of people with no funds when they retire. So what did they do? They changed it. So when you have your first day at the university, you are automatically in the retirement plan and fill out the forms for it. Or if you don't want to be in it, you can fill out some forms to get out of the retirement plan. So the retirement plan's built in unless you take action to get out of it. Now, 90% of the people sign up for those retirement plans. That's a nudge. It has a big impact positively on making good decisions in the interest of the decision maker. It doesn't tell them what they have to do or limit their options. It just presents them differently. Now, the thing is, for most of the decisions you face, there is nobody there to organize the decision for you, so there's nobody to nudge you. That's what my book is about in the presentation today. Practical ideas that will really help you nudge yourself to make better decisions, like identify that one objective of a quiet restaurant for your meeting. How are decisions typically made? Well, I think Stephen mentioned some of this at the beginning. We all developed it from personal experiences. None of us learned how to make decisions, and we certainly don't practice our decision-making skills, or don't think of it that way. We typically have the case, something happens, and so we have a decision problem. First thing we want to do is solve that problem. So we think, how could we solve that problem? We might come up with a good idea. That's one alternative, and we think, okay, let's implement it. Maybe we'll spend a little more time and come up with a few alternatives and try to choose the best somehow and implement it. This is what I call alternative focused thinking. Once you recognize that you are going to face a decision, your first thinking is on the alternatives. That's backwards. And the reason it's backwards, because why are you making the decision? Why do you care? You want to achieve something. And what you want to achieve, I call your values. They're what you care about and want to achieve. And how could you create a good alternative if you don't even know what that is? Like have a quiet place to talk, among other values. Your values then guide all else that you should do on that decision, because all the effort is put toward achieving what you want to achieve. This is what I call value-focused decision-making. It nudges you to make more informed and better decisions. Now, you can think of the whole decision-making process in 6 steps. These, the structuring and the nudging could take place anywhere, because it's providing insights to make a better decision. But you can stress the front end, which everybody can and should work on. The front end is to state the decision you want to face, then identify your values and write them out as objectives to have them in a common form, then create alternatives. Then the back end comes. You want to somehow understand how the alternatives contribute to achieving each of your objectives. Then you want to weight and balance the pros and cons. for each alternative, and then select one. My talk's on the front end here today. Why is it so crucial? Well, it takes you from your initial thoughts about a decision to an unambiguous frame, really clear what you want to address. And each contribution to that frame nudges you. And a quality front end enhances the insight that you'd ever get if you did a back end, like a giant analysis with tons of information and data. It's not going to be very good if you don't have all your objectives in the decision, or if you don't have a lot of good alternatives. And most decisions do involve some information gathering and an evaluation somehow, but very few have a full back-end analysis. So the front end is really pretty crucial. As a result of doing that front end, here's the frame you get. And so I have a frame in the picture here. For your decision, you put your objectives to indicate the values in the rows and your alternatives in the column. And then each cell in that picture, like under A for objective 1, you describe how well alternative A would measure up in terms of objective 1, i.e., what's a description of its impacts there. This frame, to answer a question that came up in Stephen's talk, indicates every bit of information you want. The information you want is to describe how well these alternatives measure up in terms of your objectives. I've worked on decisions for major companies where executives' first comment before the decision was even clear, first thing we want to do is get all the data. I think that's a little nuts because you don't know what the data is that you want until you have structure to your decision here in this decision frame. That's crucial. So the first step in the front end is your decision statement. It should clearly and accurately suggest what you want to address. And it guides you to identify, once you have that statement, to identify the values and alternatives for your decision. So it's a place to start. The result of gathering those values and alternatives may somewhat change your decision and, of course, frames it. Now, as an example, suppose you had a product, sales were down, profits were low. So somebody might decide, well, we've got to dismiss 20% of the employees to get back to profitability. So that's a decision they make. Or they might say, we got to reduce costs 15%. That's our decision. Well, you want to have some alternatives there too, as I'll mention. How about increased sales and profits, of which dismissing employees or reducing costs are some of those. So it would just be reducing wages a bit, etc. So to compose your statement, begin with the word decide, followed by one of these other words, which, what, when, whether, etc. And create and consider different decision statements. If you have a decision you feel you should face, that's an important decision. What decision to face? So think of some alternatives. Those alternatives are the statements for your decision. Now, in this problem I just mentioned, previous slide, here's 3 of them that you could come up with here. I don't think those are great examples necessarily, but they are 3 different ones you could come up with, and from them work to get better ones. Then make sure that what one you choose summarizes the decision you want to make. Now, what are some poor decision statements just to indicate it, even starting with the word decide? Decide what to do because my job isn't interesting. They might say, gee, I got a decision. My job isn't interesting. What's that even mean? It's too vague. Are you talking about that you don't get along with your boss, or that you want to talk to your boss? Are you thinking you want to improve your job? Is the decision to resign or not? Is it to get a new job? It's just not clear enough from the statement. Another type of statement that's typically poor is decide if I should visit Canada on my vacation next summer. That's assuming Canada would have anybody from the US come in next summer, but assume so. That's very, very unclear to have do one alternative or not, because the not alternative, not going to Canada, includes every other alternative that you could possibly do. So how can you appraise whether Canada is a decent alternative compared to whatever else may happen? Because you have no idea. So that's unclear. Another is just an example of where we can make a mistake. You really want to visit your grandmother who's special. She lives maybe 600 miles away. And so you think about, shall I visit her this coming weekend? And then, well, it's not a good time to go, so you don't go then. And then another weekend comes up and you do the same thing. I think it's much better to frame the decision, decide when to visit your grandmother in the next 4 months as an example. Put down the contending times and then choose the best. Then plan your time where you are so that you have the availability to go and visit her. As a result, you do visit her, which is the whole purpose of making the decision. Sometimes when we have smaller sequential decisions that are the same, like visit this week, visit next week, we never do it. And that's a much worse decision than the alternative that comes out of choosing when to go in the next 4 months. And then there's the level. Should I decide whether to exercise today? Well, I think you don't want to make a decision like that every day. It's like, shall I brush my teeth tonight? You don't want to make that. What you want is to set a policy there. I call them personal policy decisions, that you will exercise regularly. You define regularly. Maybe you say 5 times a week, 4 times on the weekdays and once on the weekend. And then, of course, there can be exceptions. Something comes up, you can't do it. You could have a plan. In that case, you're going to exercise still 5 times a week. You just need to add additional day at some time. So you want to get a good decision statement because that starts you off of what the decision is you want to address. So now, to give you a little break, maybe somebody has a question, and I think Lynn's been checking.
Yep, I'm checking. I don't see any questions just yet, but I think it's, you'll want to address this later probably. It seems critical always to have, define the problem before you try to solve it, because if you define it improperly, you're going to get the wrong answer, right? It feels like the same thing. Make sure that you know what decision you're trying to make, but clarity on how to do that, how to make, how does one learn to do that? Will you teach us how to do that later, or is that something you could address now?
Well, I can address an aspect of that. You don't learn to do it in 40 minutes or an hour, but you recognize that it is an explicit thing to do, and then you practice it. I mean, I give many, many ways to practice in the book and have a lot of problems you can practice on, but you just, that's basically the idea. It's like any single skill. If you were going to play tennis and you had to be able to hit a first serve, you could go there and just stand and hit the ball. And after you hit it into the net or in the wrong direction enough times, you'd pick up some things and you'd get a little better at that first one step. But if you even read some things, thought about it, and then followed through and really practiced, you'd get much better. And that's the idea. And we will come back to that. If anybody has any questions, we'll have a couple more breaks like this, and then of course afterwards, happy to have plenty. So
great, that's great. It's fundamental, and I think as long as we understood that there's some ways to exercise those muscles, that's great.
Now somehow my screen's not moving when I hit move. I don't know why. Oh, there was something blocking there. So second step, identify and organize your values. If you don't know what you want to achieve in making a decision, how could you possibly make a good decision? Sounds tough. So when facing it, your first thought should be, what are my values? Meaning what you care about. You can state those values in any convenient form. When I do consulting, I just tell, this is anything you care about. Because if you tell them, write them as objectives, people think, well, is something I'm thinking of an objective or not? You don't want that. It's tough to get everything out of someone's mind that's important. And in fact, it's rare that somebody can do all the objectives, all the values for a given problem. And yet they're crucial. So make it as easy as possible to get them out of their mind and written down so they can review them and notice where there are shortcomings. And people often get less than half of their objectives. They miss roughly objectives as important as the ones they don't have. The implication is you should really take this seriously. And a trivial example, but important sometimes, is the business dinner I mentioned earlier. But I did a study at a business school. I was invited to talk to all of the MBA students, 300 of them, and I agreed to do that. Did it two, the equivalent things in kind of plenaries. I wanted to use their information to make points to them. One of the simple questions I asked them was on the questionnaire that they filled out and got graded on, mainly on time put in. At the beginning, do you think you're a good decision maker? And then later on, and there was another question that said, do you think you're a better decision maker than the average in your MBA class? I got to open my talk and say, it was interesting, 94% of you thought you were good decision makers. That could easily be, given who's in this room. On the other hand, 86% of you thought you were better than the average decision maker in the class. That suggests many of you are probably over-evaluating your relative decision-making skills. And that's crucial, because when you leave here, you're going to be competing in the world with people from all the other MBA programs and people who were in those programs and people who were never in one who are just smart. You don't want to overestimate your skills relative to theirs. And then when I asked them what their objectives were later in that for their internship, which is the middle year, summer of a 2-year program, they wrote down their objectives, and then I did some other things, but on average, they wrote down 6 objectives. Later on, I asked them gave them some ways to push their thinking to get more of their objectives. And the better ones, with some techniques I'll mention, got up to 11 or 12 objectives. Then I showed them a complete list that I'd compiled with some friends of what could be someone's objectives for an internship. They checked them. On average, they checked 21. And the relative importance of the ones that they missed, because we did this individually, were just as important as the ones they got. So on one of the most important decisions in an MBA 2 years, what's your internship? They got half of their objectives. This happens in all times of crucial problems. So what's the process to help you get your values and then your objectives? First, create a wish list. Put down everything you can. Then, next slide has some things to stimulate thinking to generate more of your objectives. Then you can ask others, and then whatever on your list can guide you to additional values that are missing. Here's some of the things to stimulate them. Won't go through them completely, but what are your emotions and feelings about this decision? You mention them, then does any of that suggest specific objectives that you have or specific values you have? Think of an alternative that would be perfect. Maybe it's impossible, but it's perfect. Why is it perfect? That suggests a value. Think of a terrible alternative or something terrible that could happen as a result of this decision. Why is it terrible? Well, that suggests an objective too. It's to avoid that. So all this can stimulate ways to come up with a list of what you care about from which you can get the objectives. Now, what is an objective? It's just a clarification of a value. It is a value itself, and it puts a value in a verb-object format. Somebody may say for a decision, well, money, that's important. Well, that could mean maximize my salary, maximize profits, minimize cost, different things. Somebody says, well, one thing I care about is this smelly river. Well, that might be an objective when you pursue, what do you mean by smelly river? Reduce pollutant inflow, or restore habitat, or both, or other things. I want to be skillful. It could mean increase my skills, etc. So you just promote things. The next 3 sides show you a case of an important decision. Hope none of you really have to face, but many of us will face one or know somebody who does. Suppose you find out you have cancer. What are the objectives that you would want to consider in dealing with that? I've asked people this question and you get a few. Let me show you what a rather complete list looks like. And if you look at that, many of these you would think, yeah, they're kind of reasonable to me, but this is just too much. How could I make any sense out of this? And one thing you want to do is break them into means objectives and fundamental objectives. The means are important because they contribute to achieving the fundamental objectives better. And you might look at the ones on the right. Yeah, that's what I ultimately care about that in this decision. That's fundamental. But that's still a little bit of a mess too. You can break that right side down by organizing with components sometimes. So we have 5 major fundamental objectives here. Minimize the likelihood of death in the near future, minimize limits on activities after recuperation, provide future financial security for the family, minimize personal costs of the entire procedure, and there are different ways that contribute to cost, and minimize inconvenience for self and family. Every single one of these objectives can give you a nudge to make a more informed decision. And that's what nudges are, insights to help you make a better decision. So any questions anybody has about that?
All right, I'm taking a pause there. I haven't seen anybody type in yet.
Oh, okay.
I have a feeling that you have a really nice summary at the end that is going to be like the stepwise way to do the right thing. So I'm looking forward to seeing how we get there. Yeah, Lori?
Lynn, this is Leslie Christensen. I have one question.
Oh, great. Go ahead,
I've been listening to these and thinking about them, about when we do research at work and we try to think of the objectives and what is the true problem we're asking for a decision to be made on. And sometimes there's always that balance between, you know, what is the question you need to solve and asking too many questions. And I was wondering if the speaker could talk about that.
Sure, I'm happy to talk a bit about it. Certainly, what is the question you want to solve? Then it would be decide, the decision is decide what the question is I want to address or resolve, however you wish to word it. Then the values is your definition of what resolve or solve it would entail, i.e. what you hope to achieve. So those are different concepts. One is what's the decision, and then what are the values / objectives. And if you ended up with, let's say, too many objectives you felt, then likely you want to change the decision that you're addressing, because the one you stated, all those objectives would be relevant. So if you take a subset or limit the framing somewhat of the first decision, and then you may have a second decision address the other part, that would help deal with the issue you mentioned, I believe. So should I?
Thank you.
Sure. So the next key element is creating alternatives. And there, of course, the potential choices you have, we all know what alternatives are. There's different names people sometimes use for those. I use alternatives. They call them options, etc., things like that. There's 2 really important aspects, facts actually, about alternatives. You can never choose an alternative that you haven't identified, obviously, and your chosen alternative can be no better than the best of those you have identified, obviously. So these 2 things indicate how crucial it is to spend some time creating alternatives better than the ones that you have. And that's one of the big shortcomings for a significant decision of thinking of an alternative. Oh yeah, this will work. Yeah, let's get going and solve this. That, I think, often leads to a less quality decision than you would have to take. Spend a little more time thinking, once you've got that first alternative, of a second and a third and a fourth. If you have 4 alternatives, probably roughly the likelihood that the first one you came up with is the best is like 25%. Maybe it's a little different depending on the context. But if you create one better alternative, that's terrific. What are some of the pitfalls? Why don't we have great sets of alternatives? Well, one, often no time is spent creating alternatives. I mean, there's one that we did like it, as Stephen mentioned earlier. This decision is sort of like that one we did before, so let's just do that. So there's no time spent thinking about it. Or you don't think of an alternative, but you start searching a little and you get that one alternative. Okay, that's good enough, let's do it. Thinking too narrowly in the business as usual framework. So you put implied constraints on your thinking, and those are inappropriate. Focusing on alternatives presented by others. I mean, one thing, if somebody comes to you and said, well, you have a decision, or I have a decision, you could do A or B. Basically, in my mind, I never accept that. I could do C or D or E. And F, which might be don't do that, any of those. So what happens is I try to understand why they think one should want to choose between A and B. Why is that even a decision worth any thought? That goes back to their values. Understanding the values, then I can often create an alternative that I might prefer much better. And as we'll see in a moment, they may find it much, much better too. Another thing we do, we incrementalize. We have an alternative and we just tweak it a little. We might have used this alternative last year, and we think this year is similar, so we tweak a few things to adjust for this year. And then we don't have a lot of guidance for how to create good alternatives. Well, we do have some. We all know this advice: think outside the box. The spirit I like, obviously. However, outside of the box is a very, very large place. It's everywhere except inside that box. Now, if you're looking for something, as Lynn mentioned, you're looking for something you're supposed to take out of your house on your next trip, don't put it anywhere in the world, put it in front of the door. It's an obvious place to have it. It's the same. You want to be able to look in a place much more efficiently where good alternatives would be available. So my thought is, think inside the right size box. You need to think outside of the box, that proverbial box, but not outside of a box. And here's a picture of 2 boxes. The proverbial box is maybe 1/50th the size of the alternatives box. That box includes all the reasonable alternatives for the decision you're facing. And that one box is obviously multiple orders of magnitude smaller than everywhere else in the world outside the proverbial box. But how do you define that box? Well, what are alternatives supposed to do? They're supposed to create objectives, achieve objectives, excuse me. And so the only alternatives you care about are those that can achieve your objective in the context you're dealing with, or any of your objectives. So thinking about how to better achieve each of those objectives suggests the alternatives, and those objectives basically define the nature of the right sized box for you. Now, what's some practical guidance to create them? Well, once you've got your objectives, take each alternative and say, for this decision, what could you do that would contribute to this objective? And you come up with some ideas, and it's a little easier than the whole decision because you're only addressing one objective. Then you do it for pairs of objectives. Okay, now do that. And then maybe for 3 or 4 of them together. And what you're doing sometimes is combining the alternative components from the single objectives or pairs of objectives to create more with a whole set of objectives. And then you do that on your own first, because you don't want your thinking to be anchored on what other people say. After you've done it and you've done all you can, then you can bring in friends or knowledgeable individuals to suggest alternatives. Now, one important decision I worked on like this had to do with after 9/11. And one of the federal recommendations is to figure how to evacuate large numbers of people from large buildings. And there was a meeting that had about 35 people who were world experts on various aspects of evacuation, from fire marshals to everybody who knew something about technology people, etc. And we had what I call a value-focused brainstorming meeting for 2.5 days. And since every one of these people knew a great deal about fires and had thought a lot about it, I knew they had ideas. So I didn't want them to have those ideas clutter their thinking. So I asked them at the beginning to write down all the alternatives they could think of. Then later on, once they had all those down, they knew we were going to cover those in this meeting. I asked them to identify their objectives of evacuation. And they came up with large sets, and then we shared all of those, which typically happens. Then I asked them to create new alternatives that you hadn't thought of using these objectives. Using just one, they came up with 81. And then with pairs of objectives, 48. And then I put them into some groups of about 3 or 4, and they got 50 more. So this group, many of whom had a tremendous amount of experience, came up with a lot more alternatives. And we did a preliminary evaluation, and some of them were very innovative. They were practical, they could be done, and they would have a big impact within 10 years. And that surprised all these people. Now, some of them probably obviously weren't as good as others, but that type of effort stresses thinking, and certainly with new alternatives, that nudges you to make better decisions. So I can just go on, or we can take a question now. I got only 12 slides left. What would you like to do, Lynn?
Oh, I have one that I think maybe is
okay
to this spot, right? So how do you account for the fact that as you're working with others and they're creating ideas as, solutions and making possible suggestions, that their assumptions or the likelihood of what they're suggesting might turn out to be wrong and wouldn't work? Where do you do that testing to make sure that those are valid?
Well, that testing to me would be when you get to an evaluation of them. At least in the creation of alternatives, you don't want to start evaluating them because people are going to start cutting them down, and it could be the basis for something altered in a way that's very useful. So you don't want to evaluate them right then. Once you've got a set of your objectives and a set of your alternatives, then you have the frame. That's where the issue you raised should be addressed. And somebody can say, well, I don't think this would measure up in terms of this, it would be disastrous or something. And then that's fine to go from there. There may be some data or information that would suggest that, in fact, that's correct. But you don't want to limit thinking in creating alternatives. It's where you want to throw them out is in evaluating them.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sure. Well, here's a question. How do your decisions occur? Well, most of them are caused, as I said at the beginning, by decisions of others or happenstance or consequences of decisions you've made. There's some examples there. Each of these causes problems you need to deal with. And in fact, in Stephen's talk, that word decision problems. Why do you make decisions? To solve problems. Each of these really suggests a decision problem, and it's definitely a problem. But do you only want to deal with problems? So think of this. Who should make your decisions? When I ask this in university students, no one will answer because they're panicked they're going to get the wrong answer by saying, I should. And then I tell them, it's not a trick. Who should be making your decisions? And somebody with a lot of guts will say, I should. Yes, you should. So who should choose the decisions that you face? This is a tougher question and worthy of thought. You should, at least more than you do, because most of our decisions are those that are the problems that come to us for external reasons. Making decisions on problems that you must face is reactive. You have the power to create some decisions that you really want to face. This is proactive, and I call these decision opportunities. They really offer a lot. They're more attractive than a decision problem because you created it. And it's anything you dream about in your business or your life. They offer you the possibility to get very desirable consequences. And value-focused thinking helps you be systematic about creating these, because if you know what your values are in life or anything, you create decisions to achieve them. Examples are, decide to routinely exercise. No one assigns you that decision. Maybe a doctor. I mean, if somehow you're really out of shape, might almost demand it or strongly suggested. Develop a new work skill. You get to do that on your own. Or probably no one told you, you got to become a better decision maker. But you can tell yourself, I'd like to become a better decision maker. And the decision is decide how to do that. Each of those are nudges, just recognizing that decision opportunity. And I'd like to show how crucial that is with an example that we all know that I chose, health decisions. And this is a timeline going across the top. Suppose you feel fine today. Life goes on, and a little later, you feel ill. Now you have a decision problem. Alternatives, see the doctor or not. Now the doctor has decision problems because you walked in. And the alternatives are what to do with you, tests, etc. Tests are done, information comes through. Now there's another decision problem. What's the diagnosis? And then another one, what treatments? Hopefully you're treated and you get well again and life goes on. That's reactive solving decision problems. But what if you were proactive? You feel fine today, life goes on, but you're pursuing health decision opportunities, exercising, eating more responsibly, etc. So you may get ill, but you may not. But if you do, the alternatives are see the doctor or not. You might not be so sick that you need to visit the doctor. You might be. You visit it, and it's the same process. Hopefully you get well again. You may get well sooner. And then life goes on afterwards, and you keep pursuing health decision opportunities. The one other thing that may happen as a result of the decisions to pursue these decision opportunities, you may avoid a very serious decision problem in your future, such as, where do I get my triple bypass within 2 weeks? Now, is this model just for health? Just to show it's not. Here's the same thing for employment decisions. Here you are, you've got a job, life goes on. And I don't think many in this conference are this type of person, but a lot of people do. They've got a job, that's all they want, a job, life goes on. And then something happens and you lose your job. Now you've got the same framework as before. You got to figure out alternatives. You maybe send your resume or interview people. Now the employer has a decision, hire you or not. Hopefully you get some offers, you get a job, and life goes on. Well, a different thing, proactively, life goes on. You have a job down at the bottom, but you're improving your work skills. You're trying to contribute more to the firm where you work. Not necessarily work harder, more interestingly, and maybe even less time because you're doing more important things well. Still, it's possible, but not as likely you would lose your job if there's a cut in the number of people there, which massive amounts of that happened, some of which could have been avoided maybe by the individual and some couldn't in the COVID's examples. So you go through and what happens, you're more likely to get another job, you'll have better references to do that, etc., and you might get another job sooner, most likely. Then life goes on in a new place and you're still trying to improve your work skills. Now, What's the difference? A decision problem lowers your quality of life. Something happens that's worse than it was. Things aren't quite as good. So you solve it to get back to where you were before that decision. Decision opportunities are created to increase your quality of life relative to what you have now. Here's a picture of that. Decision problems on the left. You can see the quality of life on the y-axis there, and it's what it is today, and it stays that way for a little while, and then a decision problem occurs, like you lose your job. Your quality of life just dropped for a while. And then you get the alternative, and you work to get back to where you were, and one of those two lines in the pink-purple area will get you back to somewhere, maybe even a little above where you were, roughly where you were, maybe a little below. But let's look at the decision opportunity. Your quality of life is the same today as it was on the left side. You identify a decision opportunity. It doesn't occur, I should say, identify there. And then you think of what can you do about it. Now you're in the blue phase, and things are going to improve. That's why decision opportunities are so great. And you have more control over your life. And I will just go on. Well, I'll take a question if anybody has one. This is the last stop.
Okay, is there anyone that would like to ask a question? Okay, Ralph, go ahead, continue.
Okay, I'll go on with one thing that relates to that. This is decisions requiring authorization. Sometimes another individual, who I refer to as the authorized decision maker, controls whether an alternative that you want can be implemented. You and that authorized example both recognize your joint authority in buying and selling a house. Either one could stop that from occurring. And it may be only you recognize that the authorized decision maker shares the joint authority, and they don't even know you're thinking about the decision yet, like creating a joint business with somebody, a new one, or co-authoring a book. They may not even know. Well, what happens, the alternative might not be desirable to them. Like suppose you were buying a house, you could pay the asking price, but you couldn't pay any more. And it was a time where people were just overbidding on the house, and you can't go that high. You try to find out what are the objectives of the person selling the house. And you may find out that they're from another country, they've lived here for 4 years working, and they're going back to where they came from in 3 months. Well, you could offer to purchase the house and allow the seller to live rent-free for a couple of months after the sale and give the time when it's there, by addressing a problem they'd really have if they sold it right now. They'd have to move out, deal with all their stuff, wouldn't get to enjoy their last 3 months here, etc. I really have done that type of thing in situations to make all the inconveniences much easier for the person selling the place and purchase property for the asking price when there were bids $50,000 to $70,000 above what I was willing to pay or could pay. So what you want to do is basically offer them a deal they can't refuse. And that's how you get their authorization. How do you figure out what they can't refuse? You think of their values. They can be in the context of the decision you're dealing with. Oh, sorry, sorry. I'm sorry. Sorry, this happens all the time in my building. You can think of any values that they would have and then improve the alternative in the context of the decision you're dealing with, or maybe offer something else in exchange in addition to the deal you're dealing with. So you create a win-win situation for you and them. So to summarize, what are the nuggets here? very basic practical ideas. Really clearly state the decision that you should be facing, clearly and thoroughly. It should be you should be able to give that to anybody and say, do you understand what my decision is from this statement? Then you want to articulate your values. Create a full set of what you care about, and then organize them as objectives. Next, create alternatives. Don't just take the alternatives one. Make this an effort. Doesn't have to be forever, but a clear effort. Turn off your cell phone while you're doing it. Think. It requires thinking. Then generate some decision opportunities. Don't wait for decision problems to occur. Proactively create decision opportunities to really make your life better, or the life of others that you care about better, and to avoid future decisions. And then often, and I've certainly had this with bosses, you create alternatives that improve things for them. When I worked at the consulting firm in San Francisco, and this was before the internet, I wanted to go to New York for 3 months. And I didn't want to take time off. I could do the work there. But when I went to that firm, the first day I talked to my boss, and there were 700 people in the firm, not a tiny firm. And I said, I presume that I'm supposed to contribute professionally and financially to the firm. And aside from that, there are no restrictions. Is that correct? He was taken a little aback, but he thought about it. And he says, yeah, I guess that's it. So given I wanted to go to New York, I wouldn't be around and I couldn't help out on certain things in San Francisco if they came up. But I proposed going, and the consulting firm easily makes money if you're billing 32 hours a week. And I was, and I said, I'll get another contract and I'll bill 40 hours a week. That's pure gravy every additional hour you bill. And I said, I'll also write a draft book on siting energy facilities, large energy facilities like dams and power plants, etc. That's one of the products we had. And so I will do those things too. And there was no problem. He said, it's fine to go. And I said, I'll come back if you really need me for anything specific. No problem. And partly then, he wouldn't be threatened by everybody else saying they ought to do that, be able to take a leave, because he would just say, well, just make sure you're contributing enough, and you won't be if you're there. So that particular thing is how I use this. I use it all the time, not to get things out of people, but to make things better for them and better for me. So becoming a value-focused decision maker requires developing some skills. Learn the concepts and their usefulness. Practice. Every time you make a decision, you practice. Each time you define one decision is practice, as well as it helps you on that decision. Each time you think of an objective for a decision and think hard is practice, but it also is relevant to that decision. And this is what you want to do with any other skill like the ones mentioned there. And as you become more skilled, then you can obviously become more effective. So at the beginning, don't take the toughest of all problems. Take some easy ones, but are worthy of thought, even if you're having dinner with a good friend that you haven't seen for a while. You know, think of, what are my objectives? You got 3 hours with them, and you'll come up with some. That's worthy of thought. As a result, you may have 3 hours that are much better than they otherwise would have been. That's worth 5 minutes of thought. Spend it, and it's practice, and you don't need to take it away from other useful time when you're doing something important or having fun. So the last thoughts, being proactive and nudging yourself is really conceptually easy. But the thing is, we all have lifelong habits of being a reactive decision maker. We started learning our techniques when we were very young, because we made decisions then, and breaking such an ingrained habit is difficult. And the practice, though, will help do that, and it's worth it. So give yourself a nudge and master that skill. And thank you very much. and I'm happy to have any questions that come up.
Okay, so I'll suggest again, if you've got questions, you can type them in the chat window, or if you want to raise your hand or just unmute, we'll see you. I'm going to ask a question we had though from earlier, Ralph. There was a question about how much time should one spend gathering information, or maybe in your process, thinking about all the alternatives versus getting the decision done, like the timeliness of the decision versus the weighing of all the options.
Well, sometime if a decision absolutely has to be made by a certain time, it's pretty obvious. I mean, if the bus leaves the station at a certain time and there's no way you can influence that, your decision has to take that into account if you're going to get on that bus or not, or it'll be de facto made. But I think that is a decision itself. And I mean, that's one of the things I discuss in my book. You don't want to optimize every decision. It's nuts. People say that, oh, do the very best you can. It's not worth the time. If some decision, like a 3-hour dinner, would take me 5 hours to analyze and think about, to quote, optimize it, that would be insane. Spending 5 minutes to have it be much better would make a lot of sense. Now, I don't formally go through and analyze those decisions, but I'm aware of that. And what you make decisions for is for the impacts they have. And if you just look at your personal life, as I write there, I mean, divide it into making decisions and then enjoying the life you have as a result of those decisions, with whomever you care to be with, doing whatever you want to do, and that means enjoying the work and enjoying the non-work. And that balance is pretty crucial. And if you get way out of line there, that's terrible. If you're extremely indecisive, one of these ideas, like write down your objectives, at least moving in the right direction, and might help you become a little less indecisive. So, I mean, it's what I talked about certainly doesn't cure all those types of problems. And maybe the information part, that's different. I mean, obviously, creating alternatives is generating information. But often I think of the information that's really the costly and what people talk about, getting the information. It's the information that would help you describe how well the various alternatives, or what the consequences of the various alternatives would be. And again, I don't think it's worthwhile getting all of the information. Some you may realize I will need for sure. But until you get that decision frame and know what alternatives you have and know what the objectives are, you don't know exactly what information, certainly not all of the information that you would like, and you don't know what information you don't want. I've certainly worked on studies where people spent 6 months and millions of dollars on things like siting power plants, collecting information, and then a bunch of it wasn't useful.
Great. We have a couple more. So how would you approach this with a team? And what if the team doesn't agree on the key values?
Well, if the team didn't agree on the key values, I would suggest approaching it roughly in the way I said was really important, because otherwise they may not know that they don't agree on those key values. And I do this with teams a lot. I go through and I separately have them write down their objectives, and then you put them together and you see what they are. Now, often you can get agreement on the fundamental objectives more easily than on the means. And the reason is there's a logic that different people have that would be different, that connects various means objectives to the fundamental objectives. Also, since the fundamental objectives are the ones you need for evaluation, there's a smaller set on which they need to agree, because that describes what you ultimately want to achieve in the decision. But in the end, I mean, you can't force people to agree on values if they don't. But you can make sure they really understand that it's not words that are causing them to disagree. I mean, people can say, well, I don't want too much of this to happen. And another person says, I'm acceptable for a lot of that to happen. And then you find out the ambiguity of the too much or a lot of that, they basically agreed. And there's plenty of cases. It's basically really dig in. What are you talking about when you say this is your objective? Stating the objectives as, I'm stating the values as objectives forces people to put them in the same framework. And some, like with COVID virus, I mean, some people say we want to avoid deaths. Other people would say we want to avoid lost quality life years. And what the difference is there is a 20-year-old dying maybe has 60 years of expected life. And if they die from COVID, they lose 60 years. A 86-year-old who dies may have 2 years of expected life left given their health circumstances, or 5 if they're healthy. And should those both count the same? Different people think differently about those, and maybe you should have both of those objectives in that case. And that would require some type of trade-off between them. So I think what I talked about can certainly help when people have different objectives in identifying. And if they do and cannot agree on what they are, that's just part of the situation you're dealing with. And obviously, this doesn't change their minds.
So I have another question. How would you advise people or organizations to prioritize or weight their values? So maybe to the point that you were just talking about too, because everything isn't equal, right? And so when you're trying to consider alternatives.
Well, actually, I've written quite a lot of books on that, and that was my dissertation. But let me just say what the biggest mistake people always make is they will say things like, my health is more important than money. And a statement when you take qualitative words and say which is more important is nuts. And the reason is it depends on how much. I mean, would anybody here be willing to spend $100,000 to improve your health on 5 days in the future? I'm not talking about death or anything, just improve your health. No, in that case, the money's way more important than the health. On the other hand, would most of us spend $2,000 to have a significant improvement in our health? Absolutely. And that can be anywhere. You have to know how much of each of the items you're talking about in order to say which is more important on anything. And yet people will always answer that question. And the thing is, they may in their mind have some range of costs and some range of amount of health when they answer the question. But that range is never communicated to others or necessarily understood well by the person. So it's overwhelmingly the most problem there. You don't want to weight names of dimensions. Like the environmental impacts are more important than the social impacts, and those are more important than the health impacts, and those are more important than the costs. It depends on how big each of those are. And if all of the first three were very close to each other on the alternatives, and if the cost ranged in billions of dollars, costs would easily be most important there for making the decision. It's not an absolute statement that in general costs are more important, which doesn't make any sense at all anyway. I don't know if that helped, but
yeah,
it's a crucial problem people make all the time.
When you have these ambiguous statements where the words are imprecise, then getting everything to an apples to apples comparison, whether you could say social impact in dollars versus cost in dollars, that would be easier to compare than to have an intangible of how I feel about social impact versus a dollar cost. Is that what you're saying?
I think close, but de facto, if you care about money and you care about other things, the decision has to address how much of each are there.
Mhm.
Or you can stick your head in the sand and not address it and just make a decision on using one of the dimensions,
Yeah.
saying, now, I'm not going to use money. It's not important compared to this other thing. And then you make a decision, and maybe the best alternatives likely would be the very most expensive because it maybe buys you more of what else you want.
Yeah.
Those trade-offs must be done. And just one other example I give to people, I ask them, they want their car to be safe. And I'd say to anybody, you know, I'm pretty sure for $50,000, we could make your car safer, reduce the likelihood you die next year in a car crash. It's about 150 chances in a million. And would you do it for 50,000? Some people might. They'd say, oh, yeah, cost isn't relevant compared to safety. Once that's done, I'd say, you know, for 150,000, we can make your car safer. Would you do it? And then for 500,000, we can still make it safer. And most people are going to think, you know, I could make other aspects of my life better. I could lower my risk of dying in other aspects of my life much more easily. And everything like that for the money. The trade-off is part of the deal. You don't need to convert it into money, but you must be able to say how much it's worth. And it's just the way tough problems are. And again, neglecting those facts is very damaging to decisions.
That's great. Okay, we've run over to our 2:00 hour.
Sure, sorry.
And Ralph Oliva has a question, which he's going to ask you either here in the Zoom window or when we go over to GatherTown.
Yeah,
So
I'll just stay in the Zoom for this. It's much easier.
okay, so if you have questions and you want to talk to Ralph Keeney further, please hang in here in the Zoom window and go ahead and turn your microphones on and you can then chat with him. If you'd like to chat with your other people, feel free to go over to GatherTown.